Basically what my plan is today is I'm going to go over quite a few of the basics and fundamentals that I think, like, through coaching people over the years, I find it can be really helpful to make sure you read the tooltips and like understand what the fundamental parts of the kit are doing. And then I'll go into the 10.1 rotation and a little bit of changes that's happened with that. Okay, so to start, I'm gonna go over some of the spells. So initially, foundation of the Arcane playstyle, or really just the Arcane spec, is Arcane Charges. You can think of Arcane Charges essentially as like the combo points for Arcane. We have a handful of ways that we generate Arcane Charges, and then we have one way that we spend them with Barrage. So Arcane Charges are generated up to 4, and then you spend them with Barrage. The first Arcane Charge generator is Arcane Blast. And Arcane Blast is pretty much the primary like rotation filler for single target. But the important thing to be aware of with that is it generates 1 Arcane Charge, but the damage of Arcane Blast, the cast time, and the mana cost of Arcane Blast is dependent on how many Arcane Charges you have. This means that 0 Arcane Charges casts very slow, and it ramps up to where 4 Arcane Charges is the equivalent of basically a global. So that damage and mana cost and whatnot scales with Arcane Charges. And then Arcane Explosion is the AoE Arcane Charge generator. And the way that that works is you have to be within 10 yards of a target, but so long as you hit them, you generate an Arcane Charge. So that's your go-to filler on 3+ targets. But it is something that you can use to generate an Arcane Charge at range, like on the move, if you are in a situation that's a good thing. Okay, and then Arcane Orb. So Arcane Orb it's a talent, but we take it all the time. And the way that Arcane Orb works is it travels very similarly to Frozen Orb, except that it won't stop when it hits a target. And that's really important to be aware of, because if I were to cast it here and that training dummy was not in combat with my group, it would be now. But basically Arcane Orb, it generates 1 charge when cast, 1 Arcane Charge when cast, and then 1 Arcane Charge for each target it hits. And I just like to think of it as when I use Arcane Orb on 3 targets or more, that equals 1 Arcane Barrage, because that gives you your 4 Arcane Charges. And then on single target, it means that Arcane Orb generates 2 Arcane Charges, 1 for the cast, 1 for the hit. And then the last Arcane Charge generator is Touch of the Magi. Basically what you need to know about it is it's off the global, so it can be cast whenever. It has a fun combo with Barrage and Magi, which again, I'll go into that in the rotation section. But it generates 4 Arcane Charges, right? So it fills up your charges bar and gives you maximum ability to cast that maximum damage Arcane Blast or that full 4 charge Barrage. And then one of the talents to be aware of that is intrinsically linked to Touch of the Magi is Arcane Echo. And what Arcane Echo does is any direct damage that you deal to your Magi target, so that's AoE or single target, just direct damage, it procs for AoE damage. And this interacts with Nether Tempest. I'll go over that in just a sec. But this has an interesting interaction during Magi. And is a source of a decent amount of damage, especially in AoE. So Arcane Barrage is our spender, in the sense that we generate these Arcane Charges, and then when we cast Barrage, they get used, and the Barrage goes out. If you'll notice, that only hit 1 target. And the reason for that is because I don't have the talent Arcane Cleave right now, but this is a very important part of the Arcane toolkit to understand, is that the interaction between Resonance, which Arcane Barrage deals 15% more damage per target hit, and Arcane Cleave, which causes Barrage to cleave onto an additional target for each Arcane Charge, so up to 4 additional targets. What that means is every time you have 5 targets, your Barrage is doing 60% more damage. The important thing to be aware of for Barrage AoE damage specifically, and funnel, because when you have 4 additional targets to cleave onto with Barrage, it's increasing your single target barrage hit as well. So funnel is actually a reason why we could want to line up our CDs or hold things, you know, for a very small, short period of time. But the extra potential 60% damage on barrage can be pretty big. And then Arcane Missiles. So the way that Arcane Missiles fits into the kit right now is it's mainly used, you only cast it with clear casting unless you take Arcane Harmony. There are situations where you may need to finish stacking to 20, but I recommend taking Mana Gem and just stacking a bit more mastery. I'll talk about talents in a sec or in a little bit, but you'll be casting missiles with clear casting procs, and using clear casting procs, what that does is causes your next 2 Arcane Blasts to hit 20% harder. So this leads to what's called Nether Precision Weaving. You cast missiles with your clear casting proc. It gives you 2 stacks of Nether Precision. So that combo right there, missiles, blast, that's Nether Precision Weaving. And that's essentially what the filler is. Okay, next spell is Nether Tempest. The main thing to be aware of with Nether Tempest is that, and I find this interesting. So I cast it on here. If you'll notice, it's actually ticking like twice, right? So the dot on the mob is ticking, and then an additional AoE dot is splashing off, but also hitting that target. So the reason why that matters is because Arcane Echo procs off of every single instance of direct damage dealt, and there's no internal cooldown on that. So when you have a lot of haste and Nether Tempest is ticking really fast, each one of those ticks is actually like a double tick. So Nether Tempest does quite a bit of damage during. But that's the main thing to be aware of. It is technically a DPS increase to maintain Nether Tempest at all times, but I find myself mostly casting Nether Tempest as filler when I start running out of mana. Okay, next spell, Arcane Surge. So Arcane Surge replaced Arcane Power and Dragonflight, and basically what it does is whatever mana you have, it converts that into damage, and then it gives you your Arcane Power buff and a mana regen buff. And then there's an interaction with the tier set, but basically Arcane Surge has become like a main focal point of our damage right now, which is a big reason why Mana Gem has actually pulled ahead of Arcane Harmony. Okay, so Radiant Spark is a holdover from Shadowlands, and essentially what it does is it buffs your next 5 spells starting with 0%. So the first spell gets 0% damage buff, then 10, 20, 30, 40%. So if I were to do this and then cast Orb, the Orb didn't get any extra damage, but now I'm queued up for 10%, now 20, 30, 40% extra damage. The other part that is important to be aware of, which makes Radiant Spark very strong, and this is also the reason why we use Arcane Blast during the Radiant Spark ramp portion of the AoE ramp, is Harmonic Echo. So 20% of the damage dealt, so each direct damage thing that you deal, spell that you deal to a Radiant Spark target, each of those stacks that's consumed will proc 20% of that damage to 4 additional nearby targets. So what's so cool about that is that sits us very firmly in a 5 target niche, because Barrage is a 5 target cleave as well. So it makes our 5 target cleave insane. Rune of Power, it's going away, thankfully, in 10.1.5, but in the meantime, it's important to be aware that you have an 8-yard radius for 12 seconds for a 40% damage buff. So it's just important to know the impact of being able to, like, that 4th Radiant Spark stack Arcane Blast during your ramp, 40% lost on that is quite a lot of damage. All right, so moving on from the base spell toolkit for Arcane, I'm going to talk about a couple of like general utility miscellaneous type things. First is Prismatic Barrier. My favorite part of the Arcane toolkit used to be Greater Invis, but now that's a general mage toolkit. So Prismatic Barrier might be my favorite part of the Arcane toolkit now. So The reason why I like it so much is although it has a lower absorb amount, it reduces the amount of damage you take from an individual hit by 15%. So for example, my guild is progging Neltharion right now, and one of the hits in the later part of the first phase, I think is like 800k or something. It's massive. So what I do in raid is I will purposefully wait to use Prismatic Barrier until those big individual hits are going off. Because even though it may not absorb much, just having the buff up reduces the amount of that overall hit by 15%. Okay, and then shifting power. It's pretty straightforward, but something to just be aware of in general is it's 12 seconds of cooldown reduction on all of your cooldowns, right? So that's defensives on every mage cooldown you have. So in situations, if you know you're going to be hitting shifting power soon, and say you know you want mirror images to be up soon as well, hitting mirror images, then hitting shifting power, little things like that can lead to getting big value. And then also the interaction between 30-second cooldown on Radiant Spark and 12 seconds of cooldown reduction from shifting power means that, like, in keys, sometimes I will send Radiant Spark by itself very shortly after my initial ramp because it's up very quickly, but maybe the pack's not going to live long enough for me to get a full Magi ramp out. But I do have time to use Spark, get a little bit of that Harmonic Echo cleave, and maybe, since it's the end of a pack, if I can get an Execute Barrage, right, which I'll go into a little bit more in a sec. But basically, Radiant Spark by itself, I've always felt is a fairly strong, can be a fairly strong CD on its own. If you're in a situation where you can't really send the full ramp. But so long as it doesn't cause you to delay the ramp when you need to next time. That's the important caveat there. All right, and then the next thing is Ice Floes versus Shimmer. So I think a lot more people have been picking up the Ice Floes playstyle. I'm a huge fan, especially since they fixed the bugs. But one thing that I think a lot of people probably aren't as aware of is that Blink removes, what does it say? Frees you from all stuns and bonds. So that includes roots, stuns. I can't think of what else is covered under that, but incredibly strong. Oh, and then of course, I do have a short video on my channel, but something to be aware of with Ice Floes is one thing in particular that I've started doing is when I want to use Ice Floes, say there's a mechanic coming up and I need to move towards the end of this cast, I will try really hard to wait to activate Ice Floes until right at the end, because then it will let me kind of, let's see if I can time it well. So I can move a little bit at the end of that cast and then I still have the Ice Floes charged for the next one. So this is kind of utilizing the way that Ice Floes double dipping works. And that's what I do have a video, a short on my channel. But essentially, if you have Ice Floes up and then you're casting, and right at the end, if you hit Ice Floes again, notice this is the second spell and now the third spell, but I only use 2 charges of Ice Floes. So that's a way that you can get extra uses. All right, next, Greater Invis. Amazing, amazing, amazing button. It's Feign Death, because it's instant cast, and it's a 60% damage reduction. It's a shield wall for 3 seconds after you leave stealth. Which is insane. So when you hit it, you essentially have 4 seconds of 60% damage reduction, which is not super long. So it is important to know when you want to hit it. You know, you want to try to hit it for like right before the first tick of something goes off, so it will like last to the 3rd tick or something. Like you just want to make sure you get full value out of it, because it is easy to send it and accidentally send it a little too early and then still get trucked. And then mirror images. So mirror images are incredibly effective in keys at keeping you alive. Not because of the damage reduction, but because as you're running into a pull, if you use mirror images before you get started, so long as your mirror images are alive, you will not pull threat. right? Like that combo, not the rotation, don't pay attention to that, but the way that I walked in there, that is what it looks like in keys for me. I will precast mirror images pretty much every lust poll. If images is up, I will precast it. And then between mirror images and invis, you should have more than enough threat drop to not full threat and die, hopefully. But precasting images with how long they last is very helpful. All right, arcane talents. The important talents to be aware of is like Mana Gem. So that is our current like DPS spec right now. It's a 1.5 minute cooldown that cools down with shifting power. So what Mana Gem does is it restores 25% mana, but more importantly, it gives you a 5% damage buff for 12 seconds, which you overlap or you use right after Arcane Surge. So you can overlap that with the Rune of Power that the Surge buff gives you. So you're getting, 5% on top of that. And then Arcane Harmony, like I said before, Mana Gem's the go-to playstyle right now. This is my single target setup. But if you do want to play Arcane Harmony, because I think depending on your gear, it can sim higher. I personally have been loving the Mana Gem playstyle in general over Arcane Harmony because it's just less micromanaging. But every Arcane Missile you cast gives you a stack of Arcane Harmony, which buffs your next barrage by 5% up to 20 stacks. So it's mainly like the initial big barrage that gets your damage buff in the ramps. But basically the tier set has changed things to where we're barrage Magiing a little bit early in the ramp. So Mana Gem with a bit more mastery, stacking a bit more mastery, has pulled ahead quite a bit. Okay, so Impetus, this is a single target talent setup versus AoE talent setup, right? There's only 4 talents that I really swap between ever. So this is my single target setup, and what defines the single target setup is Impetus, which Arcane Blast has a 10% chance to generate an additional Arcane Charge, but if you're already at 4, which you generally are, there's a lot of Arcane Blast filler right now, you actually get a 10% damage buff for 10 seconds. So incredibly strong talent. And then this is just 1 point into extra Arcane Missile damage. You're only ever gonna take extra Arcane Missile damage if you are on a purely single target fight like Rashok, right? Patchwork exclusively. If there's any cleave at all ever, you want to swap out of Arcane Missiles into Arcane Cleave. So you still, because a lot of our rotation, especially in raid, but in just single target in general, our rotation has so many Arcane Blasts that taking Impetus in, like, this is a cleave raid setup that I would run with. And I can't think of a boss where I think I ran this talent on Primalist Council last year, Primalist Council last year, because there was consistently 4 targets. But this is generally what the raid setup is going to look like with Arcane Cleaves, so you can take advantage of Funnel if there are cleave targets, and then Impetus so your Arcane Blasts have a chance to proc that damage buff. Okay, so Arcane Bombardment. This is where Arcane gets its execute from. So Arcane Barrage deals double damage on targets below 35% health. I like to look at this as simply 20 stacks of Arcane Harmony, right? So when I'm making decisions about whether or not I cast Barrage or Arcane Blast during execute, I will try to include a Barrage like as with the last global of Magi, and then try to like send a Barrage out with the very last bit of the Arcane Surge buff, because Barrage snapshots, which I'll cover in a sec. I like to just think of it as, okay, if there's execute, then that target has 20 Arcane Harmony stacks on that Barrage. And so I make my decisions accordingly the same way that I have in the past about having like 20 stacks on your Barrage, because it hits incredibly hard. And then during execute on cleave, it just gets nutty. Like Neltharion phase 3 is a beautiful example of how things can just get wild with the 4 extra targets for funnel and execute on the boss. So much damage. All right, next is Siphon Storm. Okay, so Siphon Storm is what turns evocation from just give me my mana back to it's now a DPS cooldown that you sync up every single time you use Surge or Surge. So your DPS ramp, your Arcane Surge ramp, is always going to start with using Evocation to lead into the ramp because it gives you a huge damage buff. You want to make sure you fully channel it. It's very easy to accidentally think, okay, we're pulling, it's almost done. Oh, I got lucky there. But there have been many times where I have started casting at that same point and I cut it off and I only got 6 stacks. So it's important to make sure that you're waiting just long enough to get that full 7 stacks before you go into the ramp. All right, and the next talent, last talent I'm gonna go over is Slipstream. And this is what allows you to move while channeling Evocation or clear casting Arcane Missiles. The reason why it's important to be aware of this is because Arcane CDs, the ramp is very unforgiving. So a huge part of us being able to do damage is knowing where we're going to stand ahead of time. Planning where you want to drop your rune, making sure that you don't have to cancel a cast because, you know, this is not a high haste build. So canceling casts is hugely punishing, especially during a ramp. So taking advantage of every opportunity you have with Slipstream to reposition even slightly helps a lot over the long run. And then last section before 10.1 stuff, some basic concepts. So double lust management. So this temporal warp, what it does is it gives us the ability while we have the sated debuff to cast time warp again and get an additional buff called temporal warp. I think it's called temporal. Yeah. Called temporal warp on top of time warp. So we get 230% haste buffs. So the double lust is just absolutely insane. What this does though, especially this is mainly in keys, but it puts you in a position to where you get a personal lust to where you get to use time warp once in between your group lusts. You have you have about a minute window in order to do that because shifting power has cooldown reduction on the actual time warp spell, which has a 5-minute cooldown. So it's gonna come up around 4.5 minutes generally. And then I have found you wanna try to cast it by 4.5 minutes left on sated, because you don't wanna force your group to have to wait on lust. Like you don't want your time warp cooldown to not be up when sated drops. So there are times where I will, even though it feels horrible, I'll just send it on a mini burn. Right? I'll just send it not with Arcane Surge, just personal lust with a mini burn, because a cooldown used is always going to be more damage than unused, right? So, or like lost. So it's important to be aware of your sated debuff, and it's important to make sure that you do take advantage of that because haste accelerates our damage a pretty hilarious amount. All right, and then Barrage Snapshotting. So the way that Barrage calculates its damage is when you cast it, it will figure out like, okay, how many targets am I cleaving onto? What damage buffs do I have? How much damage am I actually dealing? That's calculated not when it hits the target, but it snapshots it the second you cast it, right? So what that means is if you have a buff that's just about falling off, you can cast Barrage right before that buff goes off and it'll land and still do the extra 40% damage. There's no reference, so we don't know for sure that I got that, but I have looked at it in the past. And that's how that snapshotting is how we back in the day used to snapshot and double dip this situation on the 4th spark stack, right? Because Barrage will snapshot. Now there is a situation now that you need to be aware of the snapshotting with the AoE rotation. Essentially, the important takeaway on Barrage snapshotting is it calculates the damage. It like spell queues it a little bit. So if I were to spam Barrage right now, that Barrage, even though it landed and consumed the 4th spark stack, it actually got the 3rd spark stack buff. So it missed 10% additional damage because I spell queued the Barrage and it snapshotted that spell queued damage. So when I spell queued it up, it looked and saw, okay, there's a 3rd spark, or that third spark stack, 30% damage buff, and that's what it calculates off of. Okay, so in general, I have found with Arcane that it is really important to use your cooldowns on cooldown as much as possible. I find that easier to do in raid because things kind of, you use them like as they come up, but in keys, it's pretty easy to get into a trap of holding cooldowns. At least I find it to be easy sometimes. So it's really important. I like to just try to run in with the tank, and whatever cooldowns I have up on that pull, that's what I send. And usually the cadence is you have surge one pull, then the next pull you have a mini ramp, then you have a surge ramp the next pull. And it kind of alternates, but depending on like tyrannical weeks or the key level and stuff like that, things get complicated. So the rule that I like to try to follow is whatever cooldowns you have, try to send them on pull. And so long as you can get full value out of them, you can send them. But the earlier you start your ramp on pull, the better chance you're going to have of the tank not kiting and keeping mobs grouped up, right? And well, I mean, really, that's all of it. It's you're going to have higher health targets to pump more damage into. Things are going to be grouped up. Like there's a lot of benefit to trying to start your ramp as soon as you get into combat, which also means really important to try and have your 4 Arcane Charges pooled and ready to go by the end of the last pack. If you're playing Arcane Harmony, that means 4 Arcane Charges and 20 Arcane Harmony stacks. Yes, Radiant Spark. You can think of Radiant Spark as being kind of paired to Touch of the Magi. Like Touch of the Magi, Radiant Spark, and Arcane Surge and Evocate, they're all kind of in the same vein. I will use Spark by itself in niche situations in keys like towards the second half of a long pull. If Magi is not going to come up to actually get value on that pull, sometimes I'll send Spark by itself because of the execute Harmonic Echo cleave. It can be pretty big, but outside of that, Radiant Spark should be used as a part of the ramp with Touch of the Magi. That's like 95%, 99% of the time. That's how it's going to be used. All right, and then the last concept before I get into 10.1 stuff is missile clipping. And what missile clipping is essentially if I clip that cast a little bit early, the full amount of bolts will still go out. It'll just kind of double, it'll like tag the last bolt onto the beginning of the next channel. So it's not actually a loss. So that's what missile clipping has been historically for Arcane. And we just clip the missiles a lot earlier now because of the tier bonus